Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, at whatever time that you're watching this video. This is going to be 2.3, the regions of British colonies, and the main theme that we're focusing on today is geography and environment, really how the environment of the British colonies led to a unique character for each of the regions. Our learning objective is to explain how and why environmental and other factors shape the development and expansion of various British colonies that developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. So you see already the theme shows up here for geography and the environment. Our first key concept is on the Chesapeake and the Southern colonies. So the Chesapeake and North Carolina colonies grew prosperous, exporting tobacco, a labor-intensive product initially cultivated by whites, mostly male indentured servants, and later by enslaved Africans. We see this in the original settlement of Jamestown. It's formally established in 1607 by the Virginia Joint Stock Company. At first, the settlers had gone out thinking that they would find gold, silver, and other types of mineral wealth, and forewent planting food and other necessities for their survival, which is why many of the early Jamestown settlers perished. They died. Then John Smith comes along, gets everyone to plant food, and then subsequently we have Lord Delaware, who comes in and rules more strictly, making sure that the colony can survive. John Rolfe is one of the colonists who develops a new strand of tobacco that makes it easier to grow in Virginia, and therefore it becomes more profitable to plant tobacco. As tobacco becomes a lucrative crop, the colonists in Jamestown want to expand further, plant more land, and that's where they get into conflicts with the Powhatan, the Native American tribe that's near Virginia. In Maryland, also a plantation colony. They grew tobacco. It was at first granted to Lord Baltimore by King Charles I in 1632, so it was a proprietary colony. It was set up with the intention of being a Catholic haven. We saw the acts of toleration were passed by the Maryland legislature to protect all Christian sects. However, it did not protect Jewish settlers, and in fact, it gave the death penalty for anyone who denied the divinity of Jesus. So these are our first Chesapeake area settlements, and we'll see that tobacco becomes the main crop that comes out of these two colonies. Moving right along, to talk about the labor systems that were present in the Chesapeake colonies, we have the indentured servant system, or the headright system. On the top left, you have a picture of what an indentured contract looked like. And so people would sell themselves into servitude for 5 to 7 years in England. In exchange, they would have their passage across the Atlantic paid for. After their 5 years of service, they would be released from the contract, and sometimes they would be given a land grant either from the plantation owner or from whoever held the charter to the colony. The headright system benefited the plantation owners because for every indentured contract that they received, they would be given more land within the colony. This would be white males and females from England. The reason why they would take these contracts is because the economic opportunities in England were not very good. As land becomes more scarce and more indentured servants go to the Chesapeake colonies, land becomes more scarce, or land that doesn't belong to or is used by Native Americans becomes more scarce. And we see a growing discontent amongst the western frontier Virginia farmers. They want the Virginia colony to expand its borders into Native territory, but the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, is hesitant to do so to try and keep the peace with the Native Americans. So Nathaniel Bacon gets all of the discontented farmers from the western frontier of Virginia, and first they carry out a massacre of the native tribes in western Virginia, and then they march over to Jamestown to burn down the settlement to show their discontent for the land policy of Virginia. And because the indentured servants became so disaffected after their contract ended, plantation owners then turned to another source of labor that would not produce such an unhappy population at the end of these contracts. And so that's why they turned to the African slave trade. It becomes cheaper to buy enslaved labor after the Royal African Company loses its monopoly on the transportation of enslaved people in 1689. So those two events that happened relatively close to each other, 1676 and Bacon's Rebellion, 1689, the Royal African Company loses its monopoly, really helped lead to the increase of enslaved labor in the British colonies. Moving on to the New England colonies, we see that the New England colonies, initially settled by Puritans, developed around small towns with family farms and achieved a thriving mixed economy of agriculture and commerce. Uh, the first colony that was established was the Plymouth colony, and it was established by separatists to sail on the Mayflower. So the Mayflower was the ship that they sailed on, and they were called separatists because they wanted to separate from the Anglican Church. They believed that the Anglican Church was still had very many characteristics of the Catholic Church from which it split, and so they did not want to be a part of it. And because disagreeing with the Anglican Church in England was the equivalent of disagreeing with the king, they could not safely remain in England. So they came to North America by way of the Netherlands. Puritans have similar disagreements with the Anglican Church, but they don't necessarily want to separate themselves from them. They just want to purify the Anglican Church. And they also sailed to North America, and they land in Massachusetts Bay in 1629. John Winthrop becomes the governor of the settlement of the town of Boston at the time in 1630, leading the Puritans. And there was the Civil War and the religious persecution in England that really fueled that migration to North America. The New England towns that they settled really centered around their congregation. The religious dissent within that congregational church was not always welcomed, and so anyone that disagreed with the congregational church would be banished from the colony. And we have two examples of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. They both ended up creating new settlements in what would later become Rhode Island. So we can see that religion was very important to the original separatist and Puritan colonists. Later on, New Hampshire and Connecticut are going to be cut out and awarded from the territory of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and this will be as a way to exert greater royal control over New England. So the crown back in England wanted to make sure that they didn't have too much control over their own affairs and that they still remembered who was boss. Moving on to the middle colonies. The middle colonies supported a flourishing export economy based on cereal crops and attracted a broad range of European migrants, leading to societies with greater cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity and tolerance. And so you can see on the map here on the top right what the colonies consisted of. You have Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. We know that New York used to be called New Amsterdam because it had been settled by the Dutch. And in 1664, it's taken over by the Duke of York, giving it its new name, New York. The Dutch that lived in New York were allowed to stay, continue to speak their own language, continue to practice their own religion. And then New Jersey was parceled out, taken from the rest of New York, and then it was settled by many Quakers, giving them the promise that they were going to be able to continue to practice their religion. William Penn will later get a grant or will be given awarded the land that becomes Pennsylvania, and he establishes Pennsylvania as a Quaker haven. So anyone that is Quaker can go there free of religious discrimination, and because the Quakers were also very tolerant of other religions, it creates a very diverse population of settlers that are coming from all over Europe of all different religions. Penn attempts to have friendly relations with natives. When he arrives in Pennsylvania, despite already having been granted that land by the king, he trades with Native Americans in that area so that they can settle there without any problems. And he advertises across Europe for settlers. He is given very generous land grants to the people who are willing to move to Pennsylvania. And because of this, there are going to be people that move to Pennsylvania that don't share the same pacifist Quaker views and philosophies on how natives and white settlers should interact. So they are going to end up having some contentious issues. Moving on to the economies and the labor structures of the British colonies, we will see indentured servants and then also enslaved African labor. So it says here the colonies of the southern Atlantic coast and the British West Indies used long growing seasons to develop plantation economies based on exporting staple crops. They depended on the labor of enslaved Africans, who often constituted the majority of the population in these areas, and developed their own forms of cultural and religious autonomy. So now we're really focusing on the enslaved Africans and what their life was like in these British colonies. In the picture on the top left, you see it's the first slave auction in New Amsterdam in 1655. The image is actually not contemporary to the time period. It's done in 1917, and you can see from the different elements of the image, it portrays slavery in a more negative light. It makes it look as if the person who's looking back at you in the picture is giving you a glimpse into this dark past in the nation's history. So by 1770, enslaved labor is going to be so common that Virginia is going to be the colony with the most at 187,000. While Georgia and South Carolina's population is going to be comprised of mostly enslaved people. And because they are going to outnumber the white population begins to pass laws that are going to maintain control of the enslaved population in those southern colonies. So they take these laws, adopted them from the Barbados slave codes. Barbados is an island in the Caribbean that had established enslaved labor for their sugar plantations, and had put these laws in place to try and control the behaviors of the enslaved people. So South Carolina will adopt similar laws like this, and those that are adopted in South Carolina become the model for the rest of North America in 1695. So the basis of the slave codes is that it acknowledges that it is acceptable for someone to enslave another person, and those that are enslaved are not allowed to learn how to read. They're not going to be allowed to possess any weapons, and that their movements across the colonies and across towns have to be monitored. It guarantees the return of an enslaved person in the event that they run away, and they will add more and more of these codes through the rest of the British colonial history. Despite all of these attempts at controlling the enslaved population, there are some things that we see that the enslaved population begin to do to try and maintain their autonomy. So we'll see song and dance being continued to be practiced from the song and dances that they knew in West Africa. And the influences of those songs and dances can be seen in today's Afro-Caribbean music. Another way in which they tried to maintain autonomy was through the development of a new language that is Gullah. It's a mixture of English and various West African cultures, West African languages. So when enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean and then later to North America, they would be taken from all the different regions of West Africa, and it's not always were they able to communicate and have the same language. And so Gullah really allowed them to share information and continue traditions, and by giving them a common language with which they could understand each other. Here's a closer detail of a map showing the slave populations across the original 13 colonies. You can see that the darker colors show colonies that had a greater proportion of enslaved people within the colonies, and then obviously the numbers refer to the total number of enslaved people within those populations. So while Virginia may have had the most enslaved people within its borders, at over 187,000. In South Carolina and Georgia, those populations made up a majority of the population. On the right side, it's a runaway slave ad that was taken out by Thomas Jefferson on a local Virginia newspaper. This is to show that the 1705 Virginia Slave Code allowed for the apprehension and return of runaway slaves. And so one of the ways in which enslaved people would try to resist their enslavement was by simply running away. And because slave codes across different colonies tried to guarantee the return of enslaved people, um, plantation owners throughout the South would put these ads in the newspaper and often um, offer rewards for their return. All right, moving on to the governance of these colonies. So it says distance in Britain's initially lax attention led to the colonies creating self-governing institutions that were unusually democratic for the era. The New England colonies faced power in participatory town meetings, which in turn elected members to their colonial legislatures. And the southern colonies, elite planters exercised local authority and also dominated the elected assemblies. So first we're going to talk about the cause for all of this self-governance that England allowed the 13 colonies to have. Between 1642 and 1651, the English Civil War was going on in England. The British monarchs were not really paying close attention to the colonies during this time period. Charles I, the King of England, is beheaded in 1649 during the Civil War period. And then England undergoes a period in which they're ruled by Oliver Cromwell, who uses dictatorial powers. Later on, the crown is restored with Charles II in 1660, but then the Stuart dynasty, which Charles II is a part of, doesn't last more than one descendant after Charles II, because James II, his son, is replaced in 1689 when Parliament asks William of Orange to come and be the King of England. In the 1700s, the British monarchy is going to be taken over by the Hanover monarchs. So these are going to be George I, George II, and George III. And they will have less of an interest in the British Empire's affairs. So there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of inconsistency in British government during this time, which allows the colonies to have a sort of freedom to look after their own affairs without England looking too closely or micromanaging all their actions. So here's what the New England town meetings looked like. It was the same place at which they would worship, and they would allow all those who were part of the congregation, of the church congregation, to have a say in the matter. So all males who were part of the congregation could vote. The Mayflower Compact that was written by the separatists who were sailing on the Mayflower had established an early form of self-government in Plymouth. But like I said, Plymouth gets eaten up by the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony. Because over time, religious fervor was not as strong as it was amongst the people who first settled the colony, fewer and fewer people were full members of the congregation. And so changes were made so that the congregation could have more people have a say in the town's matter. So they created the halfway covenant, meaning that if you were not a full member of the congregation, you would still technically be able to take part in town meeting matters. The colony of Connecticut is where we have the first ever written constitution in North America. They wrote the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. Later on in the southern plantation states or colonies, we have elected legislatures in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and that was dominated by elite planters, like it says in the key concepts. But it was an elected body nonetheless that was representative of the people who voted. Now, who was it that voted? It was really white free males that owned property. And because it was much easier to attain property in North America, that meant that a higher proportion of these white free males were able to vote. However, we still are leaving out women, landless men, and enslaved laborers, enslaved Africans, are still excluded from being able to vote. So while there might have been a greater degree of democracy in the colonies, it was still by no means close to being as democratic as we are today. All right, so to recap, we have to remember that tobacco in the Chesapeake and North Carolina colonies was important. The work was first done by indentured servants and then later by enslaved Africans. The New England colonies settled in towns and small farms. The middle colonies focused on cereal crops, and they were the most diverse in terms of demographics. The southern colonies exported staple crops, and they depended on enslaved African labor to grow those crops. Enslaved Africans began to grow as a share of the southern population, and there were several things that they did to try and maintain their autonomy despite being enslaved. And finally, the benign neglect from England will lead to various forms of self-government. And as the colonies become more attached to those forms of self-government, they are going to react more aggressively in the events that England is trying to take them away. So that's foreshadowing for the next historical period. Uh, that is it for today.